welcome to you all. Mr. Sweeney, Mr. Alberti, Mr. Marconi, Mr. Norris, Ms. Mokarski, everybody, please feel free if you're on mute, you can unmute yourself and speak up at any time. You're as much part of the class as anybody else. So
I'll monitor the chat too if they want to write something.
Very good. And I'll try to respond. And again, don't wait. Just raise your hand, and I'll try to answer the questions as we go. I think it's good for the flow of the class, of the information. So in any event, where was I? I was talking about, the class, and my reading of the book. My dad was a World War II veteran, flew the Hump C-47s. When I was 5 years old in 1952, he sat me down on Sunday night in front of the TV to watch Victory at Sea when it first came on in 1952, when it debuted. And so I always had, from the time I was really a little kid, this awe of veterans, people who fought in the war, because to me, that war was a terrible thing. I didn't understand at that age, or even that much. I've never been in a fight in a war. I've been a 6-year Army Reservist, won the Battle of Fayetteville, North Carolina, and captured Fort Bragg. But the point is that we just managed to understand and appreciate what these men went through in World War II. So they were always heroic to me. So when I started reading about the Civil War, I realized, my gosh, this was a war right in our country. And and it was like, I don't know, I saw pictures, photos of long lines of men charging. So it appealed to me. So I kept reading about it, even as a kid. And the more I got older, and I actually lived in Atlanta for 10 years. That was an experience, because when you live in Atlanta, you live the Civil War every day. Any of y'all live in it? Y'all? And there's 3 ways to say y'all, by the way. The way Yankees say it, y'all. And then the way most Southerners say it, really, when you hear this, it's y'all. Y-O-L-L. And then when you find that Southerners who live so far back in the woods, that they don't have paved roads, they say yow. And it really, if you listen for it, it's amazing what you hear. But in any event, so I lived there for 11 years, and it was, an experience. I joined the Atlanta Historical Society, and every street is marked off with which Army crossed the river here. I used to cross the Chattahoochee to get up to my house and my condo in Vinings in Cobb County. And I just see all these signs every single day. This is where the Army of the Cumberland crossed, Sherman. I mean, it was amazing. And and when you live there and you're single, you can just pick up and go. So I'd travel. I would get in the car and go to Chickamauga. I'd go up to Tennis Lookout Mountain. Oh my gosh. I mean, it was fabulous. And driving down to Savannah and going to Andersonville. Oh my God. You can cut the air with a knife in Andersonville. It's an amazing place. Terrible place. But the point is that it continually aroused my interest in the Civil War, and got deeper and deeper. So I lived in Anne Arundel County for 22 years. And I took a course at Anne Arundel Community College in Civil War. And it was a sweet old guy who, talked about Anne Arundel, which was primarily a secessionist county. So a couple of weeks after the course was over, I was looking at the Annapolis newspaper. A gentleman was killed, and he was an older guy. He was younger than me, who I am now, but he was an older guy, and he was in a car accident and was killed. So I was mortified by that. I said, who's going to teach Civil War courses now over at Anne Arundel? Because I had never taught anything in my life. I was an association executive. I worked for the Arthritis Foundation, the Associated Builders and Contractors, the Brooklyn Chamber of Commerce. So I volunteered. One day I went over there and I said, I'd like to do the course. I made one up, the Civil War in Central Maryland. So I started teaching. And so as time went on, I kept reading and continually reading. And I wouldn't just take the book out of the library. I would buy books that I was interested in. So right now I have at home 500 Civil War books. I hope our house, we try to not to think about fires or anything, but we have 2,000 books in our house. We have amazing numbers of books. I have probably maybe a couple of hundred, 250 World War II books as well. I can't get to them. I don't have time to get to them all. But the point is that my interest in the Civil War has been abiding and deep. And it's motivated by teaching, because what I love to do is this kind of thing, but also to answer y'all's questions. And that's what gives me the best feeling of having done something good. I feel like the fact that we don't know the Civil War as well as we should is not a great reflection on our society. I think we're still fighting the Civil War in many cases, in many ways. And I think the more we know about the deeper our understanding of the Civil War is, the more we will really understand where we were and how we need to become a better United States of America. So that's a big part of my motivation. And I think that this subject, the Border South, has a really strong impact that I never really quite got until maybe 10, 15 years ago. I never really taught this. I taught this course, at Washington College, and it got a really good response because it opened a lot of people's eyes to just how the border, which includes Maryland and Virginia, Missouri, Kentucky, even Delaware, all went their own route. What you will find is that each of those states, their experience was very, very different. It's important to know the difference. It's also important to know how important and how significant the numbers were. In the handout, you have a lot of numbers, 2 pages of numbers. I'm not a mathematician. I just copy those things and send them out. But what we'll talk about and what you'll see is that without the Border South, Confederacy had one hilariously difficult job. They had a huge challenge anyway. So did the Union. The Union had to effectively control and supply its armies in over about, if you include all of Texas, almost 750,000 square miles of southern states in order to put an end to a final end to the war. If you threw the Border South in there, Kentucky and Missouri, it would have been a far more difficult job, and it would have made it far more difficult for the Union military forces to enter the South, to basically move south effectively militarily and start controlling and maintaining and supplying their armies to eventually, not only win the battles, but control what they want and not have to give it up. That's an important thing, and that had a lot to do with the business of Manassas, the first Manassas. Once the battle was fought and the Confederates drove the Union troops back into Washington, D.C., they had to effectively control what they had won. And what happened to them was essentially that General Johnston and Beauregard, with the direct involvement of Jefferson Davis, they were at the end of the railroad line, essentially. And they were close enough to Washington where they became vulnerable once the Union recovered its numbers and trained its people once McClellan got training. And essentially, they had to pull back voluntarily. That's why they left Manassas. They couldn't control that area and then move back to the Rappahannock line around Fredericksburg. And as a result, they had to, again, win it, and they won it back at the Battle of Second Manassas. And after the Second Battle of Manassas, by that time, General Lee was in charge, and he chose not to fall back. He chose to try to invade the North. And he did. And strategically, it was a disaster. I mean, tactically, he did a pretty good job considering his small army. He did a heck of a great job of doing that. But again, he couldn't stay there. He was forced back across the river, and it looked bad, and I had a lot to do with the South or the Confederacy not being recognized by European powers. That's just the way it eventually. But the point is that for the North to and the Union forces to basically enter the South, establish, win a victory to gain ground, and then to keep it and maintain it, they couldn't have done it without railroads, without supplies, logistics. It was a logistical nightmare, but they did it eventually. And that's why I think that's the big reason why it took 4 full years to pretty much end the war. It was a war of logistics. We talk about it was the first war where trains had a lot to do with moving troops. I'm doing a course coming up in Washington College this next term on combined naval and military operations. There were many coastal naval vessels that moved troops, Union troops down along the coast and then to the Gulf Coast as well. And many other river invasions that happened, Vicksburg, the Fort Donelson and Henry on the Tennessee River under Grant, and then all of the saving of Chattanooga by Grant, and the difficulties involved in the Chattanooga area. So it was a massive job, but they finally got to do it. In the meantime, we have to look at the South, and you have to look at the logistics, and not the logistics, the demographics of what was happening. That back in 1860, before Lincoln, as soon as Lincoln was elected, South Carolina opted voted to secede. That famous Charleston Mercury headline, "The Union is dissolved." They did that just by December 10th or 12th, 1860, before even the new year started. And in fairly quick succession, 6 other states, all in Deep South, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Mississippi, Texas, they all seceded as well, relatively quick succession. And then they had their first meeting, their organizational meetings in Montgomery to form a government, name a cabinet, institute both houses of Congress. They had both. They didn't ever create a Supreme Court, but the point is that it was a kind of a mirror image, not many differences between the Confederate Constitution and the U.S. Constitution. But in effect, they did it very, very quickly. Their problem was that once March came, the other states, the Middle South, hadn't seceded. Tennessee, North Carolina, Arkansas, Virginia. Well, Virginia was more of a border state. It became, technically Virginia is a border state, but those states, they were pretty populous. And then, of course, the most populous state was Virginia. And Virginia was not anywhere near seceding either. And here Lincoln was already in office, promising not to do anything radical toward attacking the South. And the South had to wait because these middle states and border states were not apt to respond unless there was some major provocation by the Lincoln administration. And Lincoln was in an impossible situation with respect to starting a war. I don't think, before Fort Sumter, he couldn't get a handful of people across the street, to join the army and leave their jobs, and fight, Southerners. They didn't really want to do that, I don't believe. Some, a handful, certainly. But the point is that this was a bigger problem for Jefferson Davis and his cabinet and the Confederate Congress, because they needed people. With the 7 states, they only had, 33% of all white Southerners from slave states. When I say Southern states, I'm not talking necessarily about Confederates, I'm talking about the Southern slave states, which included the border states. So only 1/3 of white Southerners were from those original 7 states. And they certainly didn't have, they had the port of New Orleans, which was substantial, the port of Charleston. But they didn't have North Carolina, they didn't have Baltimore, which was the 4th largest city in America. St. Louis was about the 6th or 7th largest city in America. And all the industrial might that those cities had, they were not part of the Confederacy. So their situation was to have to grow the Confederacy and do it before too long, because otherwise, if Lincoln had just maintained his stance of no aggressive action, those 7 states would have had to likely come crawling back, because they couldn't ship all their cotton to Europe, because they didn't have a navy, they didn't have ships, because most of the ships were owned by Northern interests, and as a result, it was a massive economic problem for the original 7 states. So to them, they needed not only the border, they needed the middle states. And so they do the Fort Sumter thing. And, it always struck me that allegedly the 2 first lanyards that were pulled at Fort Sumter firing the guns, opening rounds, opening salvos, were fired by 2 Virginians, Roger Pryor and Edmund Ruffin. They were 2 of Virginia's fiercest secessionists. And I'm sure they were not down in Charleston on a golf outing. They were there to show that Virginia was leading the way and participating in this, secession movement, which was about to turn into a revolution. And so they pulled the lanyards, and the shooting war began. And when I said that, I don't think Lincoln could get 50 people to cross the street before Fort Sumter, a few days after Fort Sumter surrendered, the Navy took the 70-man garrison back up to New York with the flag that was surrendered, that they took down there. And they took the garrison up to Union Square, and they had a rally where 100,000 New Yorkers showed up, ready to go to war. So, yes, Lincoln's reaction of calling for 75,000 volunteers, immediately ignited Tennessee, North Carolina, Arkansas, and eventually Virginia. But it also ignited the North. There were many more people there, and that's what gave Lincoln the opportunity, really, even to call for 75,000 troops in the first place. And so, but there was still the issue of the border south, places like Maryland, Kentucky. And it's important and that's what we're going to try to get under the hood with each of those states and look and see what happened within those states. What were the politics? What were the dynamics, the social dynamics that caused those states to behave the way they did? So let's talk a little demographics first. Questions? Home questions? No? Okay, great. Two-fifths of all Southern manufacturing capital in 1860 was located in the border states. Certainly New Orleans was a very big city, but Baltimore was the fourth largest city in America. It was just ahead of Brooklyn, New York, which wasn't part of New York City yet. New York, Manhattan was the biggest city. Philadelphia was second. Brooklyn was third, but not by much. And Baltimore was really growing. So Baltimore was almost the third, but Baltimore was the fourth. There were others, Boston and some of the Midwestern cities were growing pretty quickly as well. But New Orleans was large, a large shipping city, large shipping port. But St. Louis was also pretty big. Louisville was a considerably large city on the Ohio River. And certainly Charleston was good size. But the point is that much of the power, the industrial power of the South was not located in the Deep South or even the Middle South. It was located on the border. And that was a major logistical problem for the Confederacy. The South kept only about 5%, all the cotton that was grown in the South. The southern states kept only about 5% of the raw cotton to finish themselves. They sent it to Europe, they sent it to Massachusetts, to the north, to bigger cities. And then, of course, they would complain that the North was making all this money off of our cotton, yet because of slavery and the need to keep slaves isolated on plantations and not allow them into cities where they could dwell and not be completely under control, they forfeited essentially the ability to finish the product and employ white Southerners as well and give them substantial income. In the South in 1860, 25% of white Southerners owned neither land nor slaves. And they were among the poorest people in America. The planter class was the wealthiest class of Americans anywhere in the United States of America. And consistently, it was they were the elite in this country. There were certainly some industrialists in the North as well, no doubt about that, bankers as well. But the chasm between the planter class and most other Southerners, even white Southerners who owned land, they were independent. They were the yeoman, what we call the yeoman farmers of the South. They were independent. They got along very well. They fed themselves. They had large families. They could grow. They could clear more land if they had enough children, male children. They could keep clearing more land, make it more productive, arable, et cetera, et cetera. But they themselves did not participate at all in the market economy, i.e. cotton. They produced enough food to be independent. But many of them hardly used cash. They used barter. They would, that's why the county seat on Saturdays and throughout most of the South, that's where the society lived. Most farmers, yeoman farmers, were independent, and they were isolated, fairly well isolated for the most part, except on Saturdays when they would do the market thing and get what they needed and trade off, barter for what they didn't have. And so their society was controlled by the highly educated, wealthy, influential planter class who controlled the state legislature, basically in their own interest. And The others hardly had much of anything to do with politics. And that would be the huge, substantial portion of Southern society. And of course, the slaves, slave owners used non-slaveholders to help control the black population, the slave population, to keep them afraid. And I think that worked, you know, and as the Civil War came closer, and then Lincoln's presence as what they all secessionists considered him a firebrand, an abolitionist, which Lincoln was not really an abolitionist. He didn't like slavery, but he was not an abolitionist. He was there primarily to defend the Union, to keep the Union together as the Civil War started. When the South fired on Fort Sumter, they were there to because they felt that slavery would best be protected in a separate Confederacy. Unionists, even Unionists on the border, like Maryland and Kentucky, etc., they were not against slavery for the most part. There were few abolitionists, but they felt slavery would best be protected within the U.S. Constitution more so than by creating a separate nation to protect and grow slavery. When I say to protect slavery, I mean to grow it, because a big part of the issue is, Kansas, Nebraska, and the business of moving west. Southerners wanted to take their slaves with them, and they felt like slavery would die off if they didn't keep growing it out west and then south, eventually into Mexico. They were talking about South America, Cuba. There had been, a lot of talk about those kinds of things, and this is what was driving the thinkers, the political leadership within the Southern states, who felt like they needed another way, because it was the way that they weren't growing. Interestingly, in the 20 years prior to the 1860s, 3 times as many white people, immigrants, three times as many whites left the slave states as entered the slave states. Immigrants, that is. Waves of immigrants were coming into the United States, but they were all coming into the North, mostly. Why? Because they liked the weather? No, because they didn't want to compete with slavery. And for the most part, that had an influential impact on the Civil War. For example, St. Louis in the state of Missouri. Missouri had been dealing with the Kansas-Nebraska issues and Manifest Destiny, and they had their border ruffians, John Brown. They were all in that basically area. They were fighting each other for 8-10 years prior to the Civil War over the issue of the growth of slavery, and it was inconclusive. But by the time the Civil War started, they were already at war, and everything was pretty clear to those folks where they had what they had to do. So they had their committed people on both sides. But that's the issue that was driving the country. It was the growth and the development of slavery. Lincoln and the new Republican Party were against the growth of slavery, and they wanted to stop it right where it was, and that's where the rub came. That's why the secessionists largely felt like they had to leave and create their own country, so to speak, despite their rhetorical support of their forefathers, starting the United States of America and the U.S. Constitution. In fact, the Confederate Constitution was very similar, just a few minor changes from the U.S. Constitution. And so as a result, you had people having to make these decisions. And even after Fort Sumter, there was still the border south, which was not moving. And many people in the border South, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky especially, they didn't want war. They understood that if there was a war, if war was to come, they were the battleground. They knew that's where North met South. And they were very much aware of it. And they resisted. They sought a middle confederacy. Governor Hicks of Maryland literally spoke of wanting to create a middle confederacy. And in the tradition of John Clay, or Henry Clay, Senator Crittenden of Kentucky was a major force in trying to create as much of a compromise as possibly could be found to allow the border states to be the border as a separate confederacy, as a separate union group, so that civil war could be avoided and people can make their own decisions about how to deal with the issue of slavery.
You can have laws like that, someone on, Zoom is saying establishment of the child.
Oh, okay.
What's this one?
Maybe pointed more towards his face.
Yeah. But I'll start with see if that's.
That's what they do.
Can you all hear me? Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, I got some thumbs up. That's good. Do you like what you're hearing? But essentially, this is where the decision-making had to come. And the states, the border south were all slave states. They all had these issues, and they were all unique. But they had massive economic power. And they had, a lot of people. Virginia was the largest slave state. This is where we want to look at the statistics. Virginia was the largest of the southern slave states. 1.5 million, 1.6 practically. It was a huge state. It had the economic interest of almost 500,000 slaves. There were 58,000 free blacks in Virginia. There were 83,000 free blacks in the small state of Maryland, but Virginia was second largest number of free blacks. Now remember, when I say free, they didn't go to the voting booths, they weren't getting educated, they couldn't own land, but they were no longer slaves. They were effectively the beginning of what we came to know as tenant farmers and sharecroppers, which really started in Maryland as much as anywhere. It's a story that isn't really ever told very thoroughly. I want to get to that at some point in some other course. But the point is that Virginia was needed in the Confederacy. There could hardly be a Confederacy without the state of Virginia. They knew that. The second most populous state was North Carolina in the Middle South. So once North Carolina came, that was a huge factor for the new Confederate government. Arkansas, not so much. Tennessee, very importantly. Although Tennessee, when it finally did secede, the whole the eastern third of Tennessee, which was the Appalachian Tennessee, the Smoky Mountains, they were steadfastly against secession. They never were really a part of the Confederacy. So even when they did secede, much of the Appalachian South, all the way from Alabama, there's a story about the Second Alabama Cavalry of white men who fought against the Confederacy. And they, during the Sherman's campaign down there, they were the Sherman's bodyguards. They were the company or the regiment that protected Sherman, and so on. That was there right from the beginning. I lived in Georgia. I know Northwest Georgia they were adamant against secession, and they felt that way. They wouldn't cross. Governor Brown, Joe Brown, was from North Georgia, and he understood that these men would not cross the border to fight in any other state. They would support the state of Georgia in secession, but they weren't going to North Carolina or anywhere else, and they didn't. But so he created what's called Joe Brown's Army, about 25,000 men, mostly all from north and western Georgia. And he used them in the defense of the state to guard ports and do things like that. So there was a lot of, even though these places seceded, there was an awful lot of resentment and foot dragging on the part of the people in the mountain areas who had very little interest in slavery. Most of them didn't own slaves and didn't want to, and were very independent and leave us alone. And so what we're talking about is a whole third of the state of Tennessee, including Rocky Top, Knoxville, and Gatlinburg and Chattanooga. They were simply not an integral part of providing men and materiel to the Confederate government and armies. The same with western part of North Carolina, the mountain country of North Carolina. That quickly became a place where if you're looking to avoid conscription, looking to desert from the army and find a nice safe haven, the hills and mountains of North Carolina quickly started filling up as soon as the Confederate government passed the Conscription Act in 1862. And so this was a huge logistical problem because they needed these men. Their armies were just not, adequate after a year or two of war. At the very beginning, yes, it was never a problem. As a matter of fact, early in the war, in the spring of 1861, the biggest problem that the Confederate government had was that it couldn't effectively arm and equip all of the people who were volunteering to serve. And they basically took about 300,000 men and who volunteered, but kept at least half of that group back at home in their local militias to train at home and to do local guard duty because they couldn't arm them. They didn't have they were not prepared to go to war. Just as Lincoln's administration in the North was not prepared. They had their old style, a lot of their old style non-rifle weapons and old cannon. The same with unrifled Napoleon cannon with very short ranges. But the difference was that in the North, they could make the rifling, they could make more cannons and do it much more quickly. The South had Tredegar Iron Works and Columbus, Georgia, and Augusta, Georgia, has two of the three main areas for making armaments and artillery type shells. So this is where the border starts really encroaching, and how even the Middle South, in certain areas where slaveholding wasn't a big deal, really started undercutting and hurting the ability of the South to get to the field and stay there and maintain, their whatever ground they could take to not be able to keep it was a problem. Yes.
So question, you said that Eastern Tennessee, basically Appalachia region, they were with the Union, essentially, they weren't. So, and I know that they drew troops, people volunteered from Eastern Tennessee to join the Union Army. So does that mean they had to leave Tennessee? Because
yes.
Tennessee seceded.
Both. It meant that some left and others stayed and resisted. And when you read, and I don't want to get into that, it's not really the subject there, but the point is that Tennessee and East Tennesseans suffered badly because of their resistance, because they, men would not fight, and the ones who didn't go fight for the North, they were the ones who went into the mountains and, you saw Cold Mountain, the movie. There was a lot of truth to what was going on in that movie, Cold Mountain. It was I'm sure it was a Hollywood production, and I divide everything by 5 when I see those kind of movies. But the fact is that there was an awful thousands of those Southerners who had to leave home and hide out because they were resisting Confederate authority. Just as you had the same thing in the North, men who didn't want to fight for the Union. Resisted authority, yes.
I've got a question online. I understand that the Eastern Shore Northern troops were also formed under the agreement that they would not leave Maryland. However, that was later violated. That's from a person.
Right, that is correct. Numerous, especially near the beginning, Maryland troops on the Union side, their whole thing was just to protect Washington from the very outset. And in order to get those men, I mean, from Lincoln's standpoint and U.S. military standpoint, I think it's fair to say that if they could just get those men to protect, to stay in Maryland and protect Washington, that would free up thousands of other men to fight in Virginia and elsewhere. So, but you're right. I think that there were a lot of men who wanted just to fight, just to be here. One of the big reasons why I think that a lot of New Yorkers, Manhattanites, resisted joining the military, and they had the terrible New York draft riots in 1863, was because they were all these immigrants, these poor immigrants, came to Manhattan, and because of the war and all the government contracts, they could get really good jobs. And with all the industrial power of New York and Brooklyn and Baltimore and Philadelphia, Boston, people were making real money. And all of a sudden, for these poor folks who live, miserable lives in Manhattan, Lower Manhattan, for example, I mean, this was their chance. They were doing many of them, not all of them, but many of them were probably doing very, very well. I know that a lot of slave-owning planters on the eastern shore of Maryland were doing pretty well as well. That while their sons were fighting for the Confederacy, they were selling their food products to Baltimore to feed the Union Army and to feed Baltimore's role in supporting the Union. So, and that's why I feel that even though that some of their rights were being abridged by not being able to vote and speak out, they were still making money. One of the interesting things I found, and pardon me for repeating this, but at the end of the war in 1865, the banks in Talbot County had 4 times as much money on deposit than they did in 1861. Somebody was making substantial amounts of money. And that's because of government contracts, and in the case of Maryland, it had been feeding. I mean, in Baltimore was growing fast. It was the 4th largest city in America, and all these people weren't feeding themselves. They were living in the city, and so that's why the tobacco industry had changed. Slavery changed on the Eastern Shore because the price of tobacco had dropped so precipitously over 25 years or 30 years. Prior to the Civil War, it was 5 cents a pound for tobacco, whereas in 1820, 1830, it was 50 cents a pound. Meanwhile, the demand for food to feed Baltimoreans, the large and ever-growing city, was not only creating more income for these large farmers who owned slaves, but it was allowing them to not have to deal with the slaves anymore, to just manumit them, let them live as tenant farmers and work food crops a couple of times a year, 2 or 3 times a year. That's how Maryland, at least on the Eastern Shore, the economy was changing, and that's why largely why there were 50% in this county. There were literally half the African Americans in this county were free blacks, and the other half, were still slaves. Didn't happen so much on the western shore, the southern counties, St. Mary's, Calvert, yeah, and they weren't shipping their food to Baltimore. For us, and for Talbot and the Eastern Shore, was a quick run right up and all the waterways in and out of the towns. You could get food up there, in no time. So the point is that had been changing. The economy has been changing in certain parts of the South, especially, and for example, in St. Louis was much the same situation. It was a large city. It had a substantial German population, Anheuser-Busch, et cetera. But the point is that German immigrants, and largely white immigrants from Europe, didn't go to the South. We talked about it before. They stayed in the North because they didn't have to compete with slaves for jobs. And they didn't want to do that in the future. And they knew that if the Confederacy was their government, they were going to have to compete with slaves for jobs. And in Baltimore, they wouldn't hear of it. And the same was the case in St. Louis, where there was a huge German population. And at the beginning of the war, men like Franz Siegel and other German political leaders who were Republicans and supported Lincoln stood up and rallied these men to confront the governor and the part of the legislature of Missouri that was clearly secessionist and wanted to make that state secede. And many of them did fight for the Confederacy, but they never got control of the city of St. Louis. And that was an industrial power at the time. Yes.
So don't you think, though, part of the reason that a particular migrant immigrant population stayed in a region was because it was more similar to where they left? Like,
Yes.
the Germans wouldn't want to go to the hot south,
Right.
You know.
They were, refugees in
it's-
many ways.
it's jobs too, but, where they were in those border states and maybe north was more like what they were used to, if they could have the foods they wanted in those
Right.
regions.
And then sometimes I had some friends, I used to work with the Arthritis Foundation. One of my regional offices was from Cincinnati. And my regional guy there was a German-American guy. And he loved history too. We could really talk. He told me I didn't know much about Cincinnati history, but he told me that in the early 1800s, when German immigrants were coming west, they were moving down the Ohio River, and they saw Cincinnati reminded them of their homes, the Rhine or the Danube or whatever, and the topography.
Cleveland area too.
Yeah.
I grew up there, and it's a big German.
Yeah. And they settled there, and they said, this is our place. And right across the river from Covington, Kentucky, where slavery was abounded, but Cincinnati was not going to become a slave, area. It was a free area, very industrious people, and that's really what the North was. When you read Alexis de Tocqueville, his travels throughout the United States, he pointed out the lethargy in enslaved states and the industriousness of northern cities. So didn't mean everybody was lazy, but the point is that there was that competitiveness and that drive, and all this time. From the 1820s, the 1830s, all along, these waves of European immigrants were coming in, and they would come to New York or Philadelphia, and they would stay for a generation or two. and live in horrendous poverty, make very little money, but their children went to the free public schools in New York and in Philadelphia and in Boston. And they got their education, and they're the ones who were able to move west and purchase land in Ohio, in Minnesota, Michigan, Iowa, and all of those states contributed strongly to the Union War effort. They were the kind of, the more I look at it, the more I'm impressed by the great industrial and patriotic power of the Midwest. The Michiganders, who fought, with Custer at Gettysburg. I mean, let's go, you Wolverines. As a football guy, college football guy, I can tell you that a lot of the teams, the mascots were from the Civil War. Living in Atlanta, I'm a huge Georgia Tech Yellow Jacket fan. And the Yellow Jackets were one of the Georgia regiments, the same with the Georgia Bulldogs, the Auburn Fighting Tigers, and the War Eagle, the Louisiana Bengal Tigers. I mean, I watch those football games, and it just hits me in the head all the time that this was all about the Civil War. These nicknames and their pride, they are about that Civil War doesn't go away. We all live the Civil War. Every time it seeps into our mind, and it's always that those are the little hidden reminders of our history. And it's important for us to get the history right, to really get a hardcore look and not delude ourselves with issues of honor and patriotism, and understand the realities that these people were dealing with, and not our proud versions of our ancestors' great deeds. Because one of the things that I think troubles me a little bit is when I've been very much aware in Georgia of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and I see on Facebook an awful lot of pictures of Lee and Jackson and the pride that people have, and salute. They post pictures, they salute. Good morning, and pride in the Confederate. What they never talk about is the men from the Appalachian area who fought against the South. There were, if you get a chance to read the book, The South versus the South by William Freeland, it is a great eye-opener. And basically it talks about how many men, from the slave states fought for the Union, resisted, and there's another book called Conscription and Conflict in the Confederacy by Albert Burton Moore, who became the head of the history department at the University of Alabama. His father was one of the Civil War era governors of the state of Alabama. And his book talks about how incredible detail about how men resisted conscription and the things, the extremes that they went to. Some of it is hilarious, but it shows such determination to resist the Confederate authority, that the alleged pride. I often think that somewhere along the way, pride has given way to vanity, because it seems that a lot of those folks who talk about that, they have great pride in their Confederate ancestors. They never talk about any of their other ancestors. Is it just the Confederate ancestors? I don't think so. I think that there was there's some, it sweeps reality under the rug. You think about Gone with the Wind and all the heroic aspects of our collective memory of the Civil War, and it doesn't really address the underside, the ugly side, the resistance on both sides, and so it's important to get that, to understand it, and own it. Yes.
Well, as part of the myth making, the belief that Lee was this gentleman who just only went to war because he believed in Virginia, that he had no stake in slavery or actively supported slavery, is wrong. It's wrong. I mean,
dare you?
it's the same.
Please leave the room. Let's talk about General Lee.
It's wrong. I mean, his armies rounded up free slaves and sent them, free black people and sent them back south. That was part of the strategy. He did enforce slavery.
And after the war, he wrote his sons, who basically had the 3 plantations. His father-in-law, Mr. Custis, his wife's dad, bequeathed the 3 properties, Arlington, and 2 other major plantations to Custis, Robert Jr., and Rooney, and told them in letters, don't ever use black people. They're lazy, they won't do anything, they don't want to do it. And that told you, it just made it so, that's not something that Douglas Southall Freeman covered very much in his books about it. But the point is that there's a lot of mythology, and I did the course, some of you were in the course on the mythology of the Civil War. It's real, and it's something that still fouls our body politic and our attitudes, because a lot of people feel like, you hear all the talk of secession these days, and they want to do it again. And the point is that it wasn't successful. It was a horrendous, it was the worst 40 years in these people's lives. It became a myth afterward that they could be proud, and they were, and there were a lot of good reasons for a lot of them to be proud, just like in the North. But when do you see that in the North? You don't really see that in Iowa or Michigan. They all have their monuments in Gettysburg and elsewhere, but they don't talk about it on the day. You don't see anything on Facebook about the Iowa Union veterans, and so it's important for us to get a hard look at this. Part of a hard look is understanding the facts, okay? And that's what we try to get done. So Virginia, large state, Georgia, Tennessee, they had been in the Union for, since, early on. And so, but when you look at them, the percentage of enslaved people in Tennessee and Georgia was 43%, Alabama 45%, Mississippi 55% of the people in that state were slaves, 57% in South Carolina. And then you look at the border south, and the percentage of slaves in Maryland was 12%. In the middle, Carolina still had only about a third. Tennessee was 24%. Missouri, 9% of the people. But there was a segment of that society that was utterly committed to secession. Okay? And that's a factor that we have to, there was a factor here in the state of Maryland. There was a segment of society that was committed to secession. And even when the state, decided that it didn't have, the legislature decided it didn't have the authority to secede from the state, these people continued their efforts to get Maryland out of the Union. And they fought for the South, and their families did everything they could to undermine the state, to get the state to finally get out of the Union. But Virginia, this is an interesting thing about Virginia. 30% of Virginia's population was slaves. But Virginia had something of the same problem that Maryland did because of the price of tobacco. They were suffering, and so most of the substantial portion of the money made from slavery in Virginia was the money that was received from the sale of slaves south to the growing slave needs of Mississippi and Texas, Arkansas, Alabama, et cetera. And so that's why with 58,000 free blacks and a growing number in Virginia, that was a substantial shock, to places like people in the political leaders of the Deep South, where there was only a tiny percentage of free blacks in those states, 1%, 2%, 3%. If you looked at the original 7 Confederate states, there were more free blacks in Baltimore, Maryland, than all those 7 original southern states combined. Think about that.
What was the year that the United States banned the importation of enslaved people?
But it was early in the 19th.
It's in the Constitution, 18, no,
Oh, it was
1820 or something.
Actually, it happened in different states.
20 years.
By the beginning of the 19th century, most of the northern states had banned slavery. Now, there was a grandfather clause where there were still some blacks who were enslaved who lived in those states, so they weren't completely free of slavery. But they had banned slavery in those states. The slave trade was banned primarily at first because of England. England banned the slave trade. But they didn't ban receiving the cotton from the South that was produced by slaves. But because that was a huge part of their economy. But the fact is that the banning of the slave trade and the banning of slavery in the North happened over maybe 20 years. I think New Jersey was one of the last states that officially banned slavery, and there were numbers of slaves. On the other hand, right across from New Jersey was Delaware, which was still a slave state in 1861, but they had a total of about less than 2,000 slaves in the state of Delaware. But they had about 18,000 free blacks. Not free in the voting free, but not slaves either. Huge difference. And so, as a border state, we'll talk about that very briefly, but next time around. But Delaware just had no reason to support the Confederacy, and the Confederacy made no real effort to get Delaware. There was no place. They didn't have a border with the South like Maryland. You had to go leave southern Delaware to Maryland before you could get to Virginia. So they were never really much of a factor, but they did become a factor on the Union side. Why? The DuPont ammunition, gunpowder factory, which produced 40% or 50% of the gunpowder and munition that the Union used during the Civil War. So it had, that was the industrial power that the South missed out on. Yes.
Out of curiosity, what caused the tobacco market to collapse? The 10%.
That I don't know. Yes.
Some of it had to do with the tobacco very hard on the soil. And the soil stops producing, but they could still raise.
But that's what drive the price up.
It made it not economic to buy, to farm.
To farm. I think that's really.
And they went to food crops.
And, that's the big difference between, as I see it, in retrospect, between Maryland deciding not to secede. It was really because of the power of the political power and the industrial power of Baltimore. You couldn't just, Baltimoreans and Marylanders knew that a secession of Maryland would be the decimation of Baltimore.
I thought there was pressure though by DC not to let Maryland secede or because they needed protection.
Oh, indeed.
around the city.
Yeah, when Abraham Lincoln made his famous, or, I could say infamous comment about to General Scott about bombard their cities, or during right after the riot, and General, was it, Butler, thank you.
I'm trying to remember from yesterday.
You guys are my memories. General Butler, Lincoln was, when he gave that order, he was literally huddled in the White House. This was in April, like the third week in April, 1861. Huddled in the White House with no support, no troops. I mean, I think I've said this before, I'll say it again, because it's incredible. You had all these secessionist militias guarding Baltimore, from allowing more Union troops in the couple of days after the Baltimore riot. But really, all they had to do was, ride down to Washington, D.C., because there was nobody protect. They could have taken Mr. Lincoln in custody, crossed over the Potomac, and kept him and simply captured him. There was virtually nobody there except some small details, largely unarmed people, soldiers, to protect them until Butler could move those first, the New York unit and those couple of Massachusetts units. That was Lincoln's only reality. So when he gave that order, he didn't have men to carry it out in Baltimore or anywhere else, really. He didn't have the munitions. He didn't have the artillery. It was an impotent thing. It was an empty gesture, essentially. He did say it, but he didn't practice it, and that was pretty important. So, but you're right. So as a result, what you're looking at here is essentially the Deep South was not in a position economically to carry on the war. I'm doing, of course, I'll do it here a term or two from now, but on the internal Confederacy, the Confederate government, and how it operated. And so they understood their money was their problem right from the beginning. And when they put an embargo on their cotton, it forced Europe to come and pick up their cotton and pay for it. But it didn't work out. And so they knew they couldn't maintain their independence from the United States unless they had more of the industrial power. And they got enough in the middle states, and there were certainly enough people in border states like Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland to fight and literally cross and go and fight for the Confederacy. But yes.
Just an aside, you're teaching that class this coming spring for Chesapeake Forum.
Oh, okay.
Inside the Confederate government.
Okay, very good. Very good.
I think he's just finding this out.
No, thank you for the update. But I'm teaching, starting in a couple of weeks up at Washington College. Yeah, I'm very excited about that. And because of the Confederate Congress and Jefferson Davis and his cabinet, because the cabinet came from the original states. But I don't want to get into that too much. But the fact is that they were deeply concerned about their ability just to maintain some semblance of economic power and military power. And like I said, they had literally to send all these excited young men home to stay home because they couldn't arm and equip at the very outset of the war. And then they had the issue of not having the armament factories to make the weapons. Like in the north, they had the Springfield Armory, which made thousands of rifled muskets and artillery galore. There was no shortage of that. I forgot what some of the other factories were out actually in the Midwest as well. So that was not a northern problem. It was a problem. They had to buy armaments from England rifles and cannon. But they didn't have the money. They needed to have a navy. They had nothing like that either. So, but they did well with the Merrimack, and they played it by ear. They ran by the seat of their pants pretty effectively. But that's as far as they could get because of their lack of industrial power. That's because of the border south. And as we go in the next couple of weeks, we'll talk literally about what the border south had and what it kept from the Confederacy and how that impacted the war. I'm 11, 12, I have 11.
Yep, so you got 18 minutes.
I don't want to keep hogging the time. Questions? Yes.
Wasn't there armament manufacturing in Harper's Ferry?
The factory, the armory, right, and yes, they took early on in the war, Governor Wise made sure that General Jackson raided and they took the weapons that were in the armory. But I'm not sure that they were rifled muskets. I think that they were older, it was older stuff. But yes, they, as a matter of fact, they used an awful lot of the captured Union guns as much as they possibly could, where they could get the ammunition from, where they could, stop a train or, that's how they did it. The North really did not have to do that, but it made it much more of a steep climb. Although I have seen it numerous occasions where at no point during the war was there a lack of arms and ammunition that didn't allow the Confederate side to fight a battle. Josiah Gorgas was the cabinet member in the Confederate cabinet who somehow managed and did a remarkably great job of keeping those armies supplied with not food, but with arms and ammunition to fight, to shoot, and to keep the war hot, literally. So a lot of credit goes to people like that. And you don't hear too much about him, but without Josiah Gorgas and his creativity, the South could not have lasted as long as it did.
Well, and the South wasn't producing clothes enough for the Army.
Right.
Because when they would invade the North, they had so many people abandon the Army because they didn't have shoes.
Right. And that's why they were known as butternuts, because they were homespun uniform, homespun clothing, and butternut was apparently the default color of the way they were able to produce uniforms, They made it work for 4 years, but it was finally a total collapse in the end. And the fact is that it drove the military hierarchy, especially General Lee, strategic thinking was that I have to win this outright soon. Otherwise, the army is going to melt away. And if you read this book called The Wartime Papers of Robert E. Lee, I have a copy of it. It's all, I could never sell that book because it's all marked up in yellow and everything from all the significant things that he talks about. One of the things that it is through and through and through everything he wrote to Seddon, the cabinet member, military guy, and Jefferson Davis, was his lack of troops. His troops were hungry much of the time, but he knew better than anybody the desperate situations. His armies were melting away. That's why he had to keep them on the move. At one point or other, by late 1863, he had stopped allowing furloughs to his soldiers from Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Texas, because they didn't come back. He was losing men all the time and complaining about it. And that's the colors my suggestion, ideas about why he felt it was necessary in 1863 in May and June to invade the North and to go to Gettysburg and try and win a massive victory. He had just lost his Stonewall Jackson in May at the Battle of Chancellorsville. But 2 weeks after Jackson died, he was in Richmond talking to the cabinet, convincing them that he needed every troop he could find to invade Pennsylvania and win a major victory and march, to Washington. Why was he so desperate? Even after losing Jackson, he was desperate because he knew he was going to lose that army eventually. Because North Carolina and Tennessee were all filling up with his deserters.
Say George Washington had the same concern about his army.
Well,
Because then they kept, leaving when their term was up, right at the end of each year.
And that was, that was the issue with conscription. The Confederate conscription, and I mentioned to you that they had to send, that they could only keep 100,000 or so of the original volunteers, true volunteers, who enlisted most of whom enlisted for 1 year. And that wasn't really seen as a problem. A lot of these guys wanted to get into the war because they thought it would be over really quick and they wanted to see Washington and kill Yankees and do some great things like that. But they thought it would be fun. Well, they found out after a few months that it wasn't going to be fun. And the desire to replace those first year guys disappeared. And as a result, when the 1 year volunteers, when their enlistment started running out in March and April of 1862, nobody was re-enlisting, and nobody was coming forward from that original other 150,000 men. And at that point, the Confederate government was completely desperate, and they passed the Conscription Act, which was a shock to the pride of people who now understood. Now, you couldn't blame the 1 year guys. The 1 year enlistees from 1861, they did what they had to do. It was their turn, and they knew that there were plenty of other men who were available, who couldn't come, who couldn't be equipped, whose job is to take over for them. Well, it didn't work out that way. And there's a great book called Company H, written by, he's featured in Ken Burns' series, really great stuff. But he has a book out called Company H. I'll think of his name. But the point is that he talked about what it was like to be a volunteer and to look forward to your enlistment and be ended, next month or next week. And all of a sudden, the government passes a Conscription Act, which makes you a troop for the duration of the war. And what happened? Where did this go? And so, morale-wise, that was a crushing blow, to the little guy who was doing the work for the slave owners, who, by the way, the same conscription law said that if you own 20 slaves or more, you don't have to serve. You can go home and protect your wife and family from the slaves. And if you own 40 or 60 or 80, you can have, for every 20 slaves, you can have another person go home and protect you. So that really didn't sit well, and it totally undermined or greatly undermined the morale of the Southern Army, even though they fought desperately and I think this is what the greatest, somebody asked about General Lee, I think that was his greatest achievement, to be able to keep that army together despite the morale issues, despite the lack of pay, which meant nothing, and despite the lack of food and everything, for them to keep fighting as desperately as they did, especially during the period that got the grant over in 1864. That's a massive tribute to this leadership. But by and large, I gave you these things, Scott, because I can see sometimes people want to start look at them. They really tell a great story. And when you look at the intensity and the number of slaves, in the Deep South, as you move further north, that changes, and the commitment to the Confederacy changes. And by the time you got to the border South, where people knew that they were going to be the battleground, places like Maryland, half the blacks were already free. What's the point of maintaining slavery and fighting for slavery, which we already gave up? On the other hand, then there's Kentucky. Kentucky is completely incongruous with Maryland. Kentucky was, it was the ninth largest state, a million people. They had 250,000 slaves in the state of Kentucky. Only 1% of those slaves, of those blacks, were free blacks. 1%. Maryland, nearly 50% were free. What possibly have changed to make that state not join the Confederacy? There are good reasons, and we'll get to that. But I think that the point is that each of these states, as I mentioned earlier, has very little to do with the other than Kentucky's history of unionism, of compromise. The great Henry Clay, the great compromiser, and Crittenden, and their unionism was extremely strong. Also, the slave area of Kentucky was limited to about a quarter of the overall size of the state. It was in the southern part of the state, the bluegrass country, essentially. And that was still pretty heavily, hit slave. But the rest of the state, especially places like Louisville, the northern part of the state, literally on the Ohio River, they did most of their business with the North. And that portion of Kentucky was strongly unionist. And we'll talk about, get into the details of exactly what transpired in that state. But that state, demographically, has little or nothing to do with the considerations that Marylanders were making at that same time, except for the fact that they didn't want war. They wanted peace. They wanted they wanted the Constitution, but they wanted to avoid war, and they wanted to avoid becoming the battleground for the war. So that is the story of what happened. But the big picture is that the South Confederacy needed them very badly, because they never came. For different and varying reasons, they didn't come across, and that has a huge bearing militarily on the ability of the Union side to begin to move on the South and start to control areas and basically put down the rebellion militarily and economically and socially. And that took 4 years. Why? Essentially because the North was no better prepared at the beginning of the war than the South. They had ships, they had a navy.
They had generals, right?
It's funny, the movie Gettysburg. So did you all see the movie when it came out? I was looking at that, and I, as soon as the night that it came out, I excused myself from my family and went to see it. And I was all excited, and I wanted to get there first because I didn't want to, get, blocked out. I didn't want to, not be able to buy my ticket. So I got there. I was the first one online. and so I got in there, and I didn't count the number of people in the theater, but it was mostly empty at the Annapolis Mall. And so I watched it. It was a great movie. I loved that movie. because I think it's, the script is almost like what you read in the books. It's almost right from what these guys have said and what they were quoted as saying. And it was an intermission in the movie. And so it was the intermission that showed intermission. So, and it stopped and we got up and started walking out. And the guy from up in the booth came running downstairs. He said, and I looked, there were 4 of us. And he said, oh, you guys, I'm going to do the intermission, but if you don't want the intermission, I can just start now. So we said, yeah, we don't want popcorn, we want to see the rest of the movie. So, son of a gun, but he turned it right back on and we sat there and it was probably a couple of nights later, and I was so impressed with the movie. I was a member, I was about to have the Naval Institute Press, it was in Annapolis, and I was a huge buff, so I joined, buy books cheap, naval books on the whole. So I learned from them that I could go see the movie on campus. This was before 9/11, you could just go to the campus anytime you want. So I went to watch it with the midshipmen. And the place was packed. I mean, I had to stand. I mean, there was just no seats in this huge room. And it was fabulous because these guys all knew, the Navy guys, they all knew something. The script where the main soldier criticizes these idiots from West Point, because that was part of the script. And it came to that point in the script, and the guy said, oh, damn these from West Point, he's German. And the place just erupted with laughter. I mean, it was hilarious. I could still hear it. I could still feel the feelings in that room. But that movie, to see it in an empty theater, quiet, and then to see it amongst the all these.
That's what I was thinking, what a contrast.
The shipmen were there before they were having a blast. So I mean, it was a great movie, and I wish that we all could appreciate, that kind of feeling, because all those guys. I mean, there were Southern guys, obviously, at the academy, and there were, and women as well. And it was moving to see that movie among those people. But you see the map, you see where the middle states are, and where the deep south is in the north. We're 11:29, yes.
May I have one in your packet?
Sure. But next week, we'll start getting into the individual states. And if you have questions and ideas and suggestions, please feel free to ask. I'm not sure which of you guys, was it Mr. Nars from Missouri? Who was the person from Missouri who corresponded with me? I'll look at that. They had Confederate ancestors from Missouri and a really good perspective on their experiences. I want to be able to speak to that.
You mentioned South by South, South against South,
South
book
versus
in your notes. Could you add to that list as you think of books that
Oh, sure.
may be of interest?
Oh, yeah, okay, I'll be happy to do that. I'll be happy, because that's just one, that's my favorite. I have people ask me a lot of times, what book would you suggest about general?
So for everyone here, when we get the handout from Mickey electronically, we'll be putting it into a handout folder that you'll get a link to so that you can go back in the future and double check these things.
There are numerous books. First of all, the best book about the Civil War that everybody should read is McPherson's book, Battle Cry of Freedom. That's the Bible.
And it's just one.
Just one book, about 700 pages. If you read it and know it, you know the Civil War. But there's so much other great literature. But Freeling it's a real stylistically written book. It's his own style. He has some other books that I also have. This book was this nonsense. He brought out the factors in it that I had never thought about before. The sheer number of men from the slave states who fought against the South. Boy, those were the South. They had if that 300,000 or so was reversed, my God, it would have been a completely different war. Had those border states been literally part of the Confederacy, the Confederacy would have bordered on the Ohio River. I mean, that's something, and they would have had the power, the economic power of Baltimore and St. Louis and other substantial cities. But they didn't. They were slave states. And that's what the Confederacy was effectively organized to protect slavery. So it had everything to do with the outcome of the Civil War. The Civil War outcome, I think, would have been very different had the border south behaved differently.
So what can we expect next week?
We're going to talk about, I'll get into Maryland first. Maryland and Kentucky, I think, are the two the most fascinating because they're so different. But they're very real. They're very real stories. We'll talk about approximately how many men fought for the Union and what it did and what it allowed the Union military to do. Use the river systems that flow south into Tennessee and Alabama, to use those systems, those rivers, as invasion avenues under Grant and Sherman and people like that. If the border south had seceded, they wouldn't have been in a position to do that for a year or two. So, anyway, other last questions for today? Anybody? No. All right. Thank you very much. I'm so glad to be back. Thank you for being here. Look forward to seeing you next week.